everybody. Welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. We've hoped that for the last 3 weeks you've enjoyed our documentary put out by the website InfoWars called Endgame. And in that 3-week period of time, a lot has happened in the world. I think you'll have to agree with that. We have the country of Greece, which is in absolute anarchy and turmoil right now. We have food riots going on right now in 4 different continents. We have Iceland, which has told the bankers, no, we will not pay up on your default. And I thought, folks, that we would sort of take a look at this last 3-week period because it is so tumultuous, and bring it into perspective of what's going on in the United States of America, what's going on throughout the world, and who are the players behind it. It's interesting when you find out, folks, that some of the common denominators of the countries that are in financial dire straits right now, there are multiple of common denominators, but the biggest common denominator is this. It's that their money systems are all controlled by the same banking international houses. Private banks controlling the issuance of their currency. Now, the countries that I'm talking about right now have become to be known as the P.I.G.S, an acronym being for Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Now, when you look at these countries, folks, different cultures, different histories, different leadership, supposedly, different forms of government, supposedly. The only common denominator with these 5 group of countries that are in dire straits, again, is that they are controlled by private banking interest. The interesting thing about this, folks, is these are the same private banking interests that control your life here in the United States of America. They're the same interests that created and orchestrated the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund through the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank through the Bretton Woods Agreement. These are the same entities that are using the same ploys and the same mechanisms of devastation on these countries. And the mainstream media here in the United States has been very shy, if at all, demonstrating of what's going on in these countries. Folks, there are mass riots going on. People are being murdered. Whole cities are in chaos currently. The rule of law and order, if you would, is gotten to almost to the point of anarchy. There are parts in Athens, Greece, that the police are no longer entering. And you may be saying, gee, Tom, I can tell you some neighborhoods here in the United States where the police won't enter either. But this is a different case because ours has been through a mechanism of welfare and social decay and so forth, where this is economic downturn. This is the confiscation of the wealth, of the intrinsic value of these countries. And the country of Iceland, I am proud to say, has told the international bankers, no, we won't pay. We simply will not pay. And of course, you're not hearing about what's going on in Iceland anymore. You're not hearing about it at all because, folks, yeah, Iceland is hurting, but they are mending and licking their wounds. And they're not putting themselves deeper into the grasp of the international bankers by going into debt to pay for defaults that these bankers purposely, and I did say the word purposely, created. So let's go back a little bit and see who is controlling the mechanisms of the P.I.G.S right now, all right, and why their countries are faltering, why some other countries are not faltering, but they're the boogeyman or men of the world. I think you're going to find some interesting correlations. But what we have to do first, folks, is we have to go back and find out who were the players that orchestrated and set this whole game up, this whole monopoly. And of course, if you've been watching this show for the last 2 years, we've got into in absolute detail about the meeting at Jekyll Island that took place. We've gotten into all the major players, both on the governmental and non-governmental banking, non-banking entities. And I thought it would be interesting to list the main players that set up the meeting at Jekyll Island, which created the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And listen to these names and tell me if you think think that they are looking out for your interest, your children's interest, and the interest of our nation. Of course, as we've demonstrated before, this was all done secretly. We had the liaison of the whole scheme, if you would, at Jekyll Island. His name was Nelson Aldrich. Nelson Aldrich was the Republican whip in the Senate. He was a senator from Rhode Island. He wound up marrying into the Rockefeller family down the road, as in David Aldrich Rockefeller, taking the name from. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller. Again, he was also chairman of the National Monetary Commission. Okay, so this person, this Senator Aldrich, he was the liaison, folks. He was the one through the House of Rothschilds, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburgs that got together and basically said, hey, you know what? We've been competing at each other's throats for centuries. There's a big there's a big pie here. It's called the world. And there's enough of this pie that we can satisfy our own self-greed of money and power, and we could, if we all work together. So Senator Aldrich from Rhode Island, he became the liaison. He was the one who set up the meeting at Jekyll Island in Georgia. He was the one who coordinated all the interests, the international interests that own and control our money system through the Federal Reserve. As a matter of fact, folks, if you go back to 1908, when they created the Panic of 1908, they actually had a bill, because Mr. Aldrich was a very egotistical man, and it was called the Aldrich Bill. And you can look this up if you want, but it was exposed to the day of light, and basically what happened was the Congress voted it down. And interesting enough, folks, when you find out after the Panic of 1908 and 1910, again created by the international banking interest, after they met secretly, basically you find out that all the people that created these panics and crises are the same players who created the Federal Reserve Act. So let's continue with who these people were. Abraham Pyatt Andrew, he was Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury. Now think of this, folks. You got the person, the National Republican whip for the chairman of the National Monetary Commission, and you've got the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and they're all working in a conspiracy, in a secret conspiracy with international bankers to put the power of the issuance and the value of our currency and our monetary policies of all the commerce, all the industry, into foreign private hands. You have to understand this. Frank A. Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, at the time, one of the most powerful banks at the time, representing the Rockefeller and international banking interest of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Folks, anytime you hear the Kuhn and Loeb and Company, you'll be hearing in the background, there'll be people like Schick, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the Warburgs, all out of Europe. Henry P. Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton, president of J.P. Morgan Company. And again, J.P. Morgan, folks, working for the interest not only of his own banking house, but of the Rothschilds. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Banker Trust and through Loeb, and also Paul Warburg, who really, folks, was the father of the Federal Reserve through Kuhn and Loeb Company, a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and brother to Max Warburg, who was head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and throughout the Netherlands. So, okay, so we have a list of the people who actually formed this secretly. They all met secretly. It's really interesting when you get into the depth of how they did this, folks. They weren't allowed to talk to each other on the trains. They ate separately. They all went down to Jekyll Island, basically going down to have a duck hunt. The whole ploy of this was so nobody would be aroused, because we did still have a little bit of actual research media in this country at that time. So they basically went down separately, independently of each other, on the same group of train cars, but independently of each other. They were not allowed to associate. They didn't ever use their last names, and they also went down there with a ploy for a duck hunt. Now, interesting enough through this, there was a committee formed, and And basically what it was a committee in 1913. It was, by the way, again, the same year the Federal Reserve Act was passed, by a subcommittee of the House Committee on Currency and Banking, and under the chairmanship of Arsène Pujol of Louisiana. Now, when you study this Arsène Pujol, folks, you're going to find that he's in the same ploy, if you would, of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. I mean, of Nelson Aldrich. Senator Nelson Aldrich was basically, again, the liaison. Well, the person they put in charge to investigate this Federal Reserve Act of 1913, again, was named the Pujol Committee after Arsène Pujol of Louisiana. And folks, just to read verbatim here, Pujol was considered to be a spokesman for oil and banking interests, part of the very group that was under investigation, and did everything possible to sabotage the hearings. Now, when you study this, folks, he's like most judges today. He's working for the corporation of the power at hand. You know, the judges who don't allow this evidence to be presented, don't allow that evidence to be presented. I'm not going to allow this. I'm not going to allow that. Okay? They're all working for the same entity, folks, because they're all getting their paycheck from the same thing. But basically, even with all this information and all this evidence being withheld from the Pujol Committee, I wanted to read to you exactly what their findings were, and I wanted to be real short with this. The committee is satisfied from the proof submitted. Now, this is Pujol writing here. He signed off on this. Even in the absence of data from the banks, I want you to think about this. He's very satisfied with the proof submitted, even in the absence of any data from the banks. Folks, what were they determining here? They were supposed to be determining the actions and mechanisms of the Federal Reserve Act itself, but none of it was presented. But yet he was very satisfied with this. Really incredible when you listen to this language. And folks, this is taken from the congressional record. Okay? So again, the committee is satisfied from the proof submitted, even in the absence of data from the banks, that there is an established and well-defined identity and community of interest between a few leaders of finance. The interest, folks, is this the interest of the nation? Of our future? No, this is the interest of what? Between a few leaders of finance, which has resulted in great and rapidly growing concentration of the control of money and credit in the hands of these few men. Under our system of issuing and distributing corporate securities and investing, the public does not buy directly from the corporation. The securities travel from the issuing house through the middlemen to the investor. It is only the great banks or bankers with access to the mainsprings of the concentrated resources made up from other people's money. Folks, who do you think the other people's money is? You think it's theirs? Negative. It's ours. This is what they're after. This is what they've accomplished. But this was written in 1913. This has not happened yet. If you've been watching this show, you understand that we do not have money. Because if you remember, money did not encompass instruments of debt by the definition of law. What do we work for? A Federal Reserve note. What is a note? An acknowledgement of debt. What is the Federal Reserve? A private foreign bank. Think of this. And there's an interest due, folks, on every one of them Federal Reserve notes that you have in your pocket. There's an interest due beyond it because they gave us permission to print it in the first place. So think of this. Let's continue here. It is only the great banks or bankers with access to the mainsprings of concentrated resources made up of other people's money, ours money, the nation's money, in the banks, trust companies, and life insurance companies, and with the control of the machinery for creating markets and distributing securities. Creating markets. Boy, can you say derivatives? And you ought to say derivatives, folks, because you just spent $27.3 trillion bailing out these derivatives that they orchestrated back in 1913. They made all the money coming up, and now they're making all the money as it comes down. And why? Because they transferred the liability to your backs. Let's continue. who have had the power to underwrite or guarantee the sale of large-scale security issues. The men who, through their control of these funds of our railroad and industry companies, are now able to direct where such funds are kept, and thus to create these great reservoirs of other people's money, are the ones who are in a position to tap these reservoirs for the ventures in which they are interested, and to prevent them from being tapped for the purposes which they do not approve. You wonder why there's no free energy? Tesla's free energy machines? You wonder why we're still using 1928 technology with our gasoline motors? Folks, because they're making the profit off of all this. They don't want every house here to be self-sufficient with regards to electrical power. They don't want you driving cars that run on electricity and solar power, or hydrogen by separating water. Folks, if you want to get interested in some things, go on the internet and punch in subdued science, and it'll take you to areas where patents that have been proven to work and patents that have been purchased by big oil companies and big bankers. And they control the patents, so they control whether this is going to be issued and put into the manufacturing mode or not. Of course, it's not going to be. They want to keep you there. Oh, we're doing so wonderful now because we have cars that get 32 gallons to a mile. 32 miles to a gallon. My apologies. Folks, what's 32 miles to the gallon? It's nothing. We have satellites that have been working out in space with 1963 solar technology still out there flying around in orbit. You don't think that if they could do that in 1963 and 2011, we don't have the ability to use smaller solar panels and capture more and have our own cars that go along without having to go to the pump? Or you can go to your fountain and fill up water and have the hydrogen separated from the oxygen. And then think of what you're releasing. You're releasing oxygen because you're using the hydrogen. Folks, this is what they're talking about here. This isn't just the control of the currency that's in your pocket. This is the control of science, of education, of news media. All of it. This is what they gained by this. The latter is quite as important as a factor as the former. It is a controlling consideration in effect on the competition in the railroad and industrial world as a whole. When we consider also in this connection that into these reservoirs of money and credit there flow a large part of the reserves of the bank of the entire country. Think of what they're saying here now, okay? They're telling you right now, folks, that these people not only are going to control the railroad and the entire commerce and industry of the world, they're also going to control the large part of reserves of the banks of the entire country. I'll take that a step further, folks. This is the P.I.G.S Committee in 1913. They now do control all the banks of the country. There are only two banks that I'm aware of that are not tied into the Federal Reserve. One of them I'm not sure if still around. The other one is a bank in one of the Dakotas. I believe it's South Dakota. And basically, folks, it is a bank that was set up by Native American Indians, because they do not have the so-called rights of American citizenship, and they also do not have the obligations of American citizenship. Because, folks, if you're an American citizen, you're a corporate entity. We've gotten into that. We've read to you verbatim the Organic Act of 1871, when the United States government became a corporation. The problem here, folks, is that another corporation took over its money system and put that one corporation that you are a part of into insolvency. This whole thing, folks, is a settlement of debt between corporations, and you're stuck in the middle of it because of your ignorance. That's why. You don't understand what a real dollar is. And we read it to you through the Coinage Acts. A real dollar is what? 25.8 grains of gold and a 15-to-1 ratio of silver. What are we using for a medium of exchange? We're using legal tender, a Federal Reserve note. So what happened to all of our gold? What happened to all of our silver? Don't say it's at Fort Knox. JFK proved there was no gold at Fort Knox. And when he did an audit and found out there was only $4.28 billion worth of silver there, what did he do? He started issuing silver certificates like the one right here. And we've been through all this. So folks, this group since 1913 has consolidated its efforts here in the United States, but also now through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have expanded the same game abroad. And it's not the first time they did this. They did it to Germany in the 20s and 30s, and then financed Hitler, and we know the history of what took place there. Don't say, oh, come on, Tom, we financed Hitler. Folks, we have read this to you verbatim also. As a matter of fact, if you remember, the Union Bank, Brown Brothers Union Bank of New York, Brown Brothers Harriman, you can look this up, and the Reich Bank of Germany, do you remember who the fund manager was between these two banks? We read it verbatim to you. He was a senator from Connecticut. His name was Bush. He was the grandfather of George W. Bush, as in Senator Prescott Bush of Connecticut. Of course, he was all tied into the Skull and Bones, which started out in Bavaria and is very, very strong in Germany. So when you hear of these secret societies, folks, these aren't just boys' clubs where they get together and play golf. These are organizations where they get secretly and organize themselves and in a coordinated effort to dominate the world. There's no other way of putting it. So let's stay with the pigs here, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, because these people that I'm just mentioned and these orchestrations that I'm mentioning here through this P.I.G.S committee, their acts are very as important more today than they were even then, because they've consolidated the power, they've consolidated the wealth, they have all the mechanisms in place. Okay. They got parts of the, large parts of the reserves of the entire country. Of course, they have it all now. And that they are also agents and correspondents of banks in the loaning of their surplus funds in the only public money market of the country. So there's one money market for you and I, and they control it here. Okay? And that a small group of men and their partners and associates now have further strengthened their hold upon the resources of these institutions by acquiring stock holdings therein by representation on their boards, and through valuable patronage, we begin to realize something of the extent to which this practical and effective domination and control over our greatest financial, railroad, industrial, commerce corporations have developed, largely within the past 5 years, and that it is fraught with peril to the welfare of this country. Folks, this is what the P.I.G.S committee came out with, even though Arsène P.I.G.S was keeping all this information back from them. And if you go back to the beginning of this, even in the absence of data from the banks. Imagine if they had the information and the data from the banks, what they would have found. This is where we are, folks, in the year 2011. And if you want to go further, folks, this is why you bond your children. Because the corporation, they took all the gold and silver. They leaned to the public trust. There's nothing left. This is why you don't own your land. You don't own your car. You don't own your land. You don't own a thing. You don't even own your own name. Your name is a corporate entity. A nom de guerre, as it's called in law. And this is why. Because this corporation that you affiliate yourself with has gone insolvent. And like any corporation that's gone insolvent, what do? Assets, assets, assets. You are an asset. Do you remember when we went to the Dun & Bradstreet and we looked up the United States government and found out that it was a for-profit corporation? Now, if you missed that show, go on the internet, punch in Dun & Bradstreet, And what they basically do is they list all corporations, and they list what type of corporations they are and what their mood standings are and all these different things. And that's Moody is a bond reference. It's not whether they're in a good mood or a bad mood. It's a bond reference, what their credit rating is as a corporation. As a matter of fact, it's been recently on the news that some of the states, the Moody ratings have come down because they're so insolvent. Now it's going to cost them more to borrow money from these very same bankers. That's what they're talking about. So basically, when the corporation had no more gold or silver, the public trust was liened. What was the only thing left the corporation had to offer for collateral? Your labors. So what do? Being the good, ignorant, apathetic American, you signed a birth certificate. The mother did, as a bond, because the mother is the only one, because the mother brings the child into the world. So the mother has the right to negotiate contract for this baby, for this child, until the baby reaches adult age and can contract for himself or herself. So the mothers, hey, sign this, sign this, sign this. You don't read what you're signing. Folks, you bond your children. Look up the birth certificate. You remember I brought in a copy of my bond. We showed it to you from the Midwest Bank Note Company. I was born 11/10/58 on 11/12/58 because my mother signed papers. I was bonded as collateral. Remember, we got into the Browns Index. The Browns Index is when they started this, how they came up with the life insurance and how much everyone paid. It was the average white married male, potential earnings from certain ages on. Do you remember all that? We did all that. Well, all they did was take the Browns Index used by the insurance companies and flip-flopped it around. Not for payout, but for pay-in to the bankers. That's what they figured out. Of course, they quit using the average white married male because they wanted everybody under the cloak of debt. So they use everybody now. And again, I don't want to go back, but we did quite a show on that, folks. And if you're not watching this show, you need to start, because you're learning truth. So when you hear about the state of Illinois now, their Moody, I was reading this past week, their Moody credit rating is gone. It's going to cost them so much more to borrow money. They're not borrowing money. They're getting issued credit. We have no money. But this very same bankers that are bleeding them are the ones who are setting the ratings on what they're going to pay for interest. This is where we are. Okay. So let's continue here. This is something from 1916. It's called Leslie's Weekly. And this is Paul Warburg talking. And he really didn't want to at this point, but it was later on in years. I said 1916. It was 3 years later, and he was pretty comfortable because they had accomplished so much. But listen to this, what he says here. Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under the cover of darkness, stealthily hiding hundreds of miles of south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week under such rigid security that the names of not one of them was once mentioned, lest the servants learn their identity and disclose to the world their strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I am not romancing. I am giving to the world for the first time the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report, Senator Aldrich, Nelson Aldrich, reported the foundation of our new currency system. The results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact that there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. Imagine that. Now, let's continue here. This is from February 9th, 1935, Saturday Evening Post, an article written by Frank Vanderlip. Despite my views about the value to society of a greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I did not feel it in any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. So was the Federal Reserve System, folks, written in the halls of Congress with your representatives? No, it was written secretly by a bunch of international bankers. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further we should avoid dining together on the night. But he gets into all this, how they went secretly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I pretty much got into that. The servants and the train crew may have known our identities of one or two of us, but they did not know us all. It was the names that were all printed together that we would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington and in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all of our time and efforts of the past years would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would certainly have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress. Wow. Think of what he's telling you right there. And then, folks, as we all know from watching this show, they put the bill in place on December 23rd, 1913, while the Congress was away for the Christmas break. The Congress came back in January and discovered that the issuance power of the United States government had been usurped by a group of foreign and domestic international bankers. Now, how they do this is they create panics, okay? And I just want you to listen to how they got to the point, to get to the point of 1913. This is historian John Klein. And listen to what he's talking about here. The financial panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, 1903, 1907 were a part of an outgrowth of reserve pyramiding and excessive deposit creation by banks. These panics, were triggered by currency drains that took place in periods of relative prosperity when the banks were loaned up. In other words, the panics and the resulting bank failures were caused not by negative factors in the economy, but by the currency drains on the banks. The banks did not fail because the system was weak. The system failed because the banks became weak. Again, once they got control of the issuance of the currency, folks, think of it. Think of the Roaring '20s. They gave everybody credit, right? Everybody got credit. So but what does that do? It puts everybody in debt. And some of them in debt did what? Once they called the loans, what did it do? It transferred the wealth of the property of the intrinsic value of the country. Okay? Now, let's do real quickly the main challenges that faced the group. This is a list of what they actually wanted to accomplish with this bill. How to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure the control of the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. Again, them present at the meeting. How to make the money supply more elastic in order to reserve the trend of private capital formation and to capture the industrial loan market. How to pool the meager reserves of the nation's bank into one large reserve so that all banks will be motivated to follow the same loan-to-deposit ratios. This would protect at least some of them from currency drains and bank runs. Folks, let's get into that a little bit. What is basically a loan-to-deposit ratio? When we had a stable banking system, for the bank to loan out $1, the bank had to have $1 in a vault, in a reserve, to cover that loan, that dollar. So then when the Federal Reserve took over to give everybody easy credit, what they basically did was they lowered that demand of what they had to have in reserve. Okay? And now, folks, we are at the point, and I'm going to use Alan Greenspan's testimony in Congress to qualify this. Alan Greenspan, during Y2K, a congressman asked him, how much because he was concerned about bank runs, obviously didn't understand the banking system. How much do you think, what's the percentage of people do you think will take out money out of the bank? What are your forecasts? And Alan Greenspan just sat there cockily and said, Oh, we estimate only 2% of the American people will take the money out of their banks. Folks, and I want to tell you how we got that figure. Because we were on a 2% ratio to loan reserve capacity. In other words, for every dollar they have lent out, there's 2 cents in the back room backing it up. Then you say, well, Tom, how could we lend money? We don't have money, folks. Again, watch this show. We got into the particulars how they create loans, okay? You want to buy a car. So you put the car up for collateral, and then you sign a promissory note to this lending institution for, let's say $5,000 to keep the numbers simple. So they take that promissory note, because after all, folks, what is our medium of exchange? Notes, notes, notes. So they take that promissory note, you promise to pay them X amount of notes, an X amount of term, an X amount of interest, right, every month. Well, they take that, folks, that promissory note, and they put it on their books as an entry as a positive, and then because now they got that positive asset, then they cut you a check with backing of your promissory note that you gave them in the first place. And that's why, folks, whenever you go get a loan, you got to sign first, and the bank just comes right out with the check, here you go. That's why. Because you created the asset. All of our instruments are debt. Do you remember we got into that one time, probably about a year and a half ago, how we couldn't pay off all the mortgages and all the debt because we wouldn't have any money. And we took that from from the president of the Bank of Chicago. I don't remember his name, but I remember he was the president of the Bank of Chicago, and we used it. It was called How Money Works, and he just laid it right out for us, the mechanics of it. Do you remember when we gave the bankers $14.7 trillion, and I said, well, why is it that if they really wanted to relieve the pressures on the American people, all the mortgages in the country combined were only 9.3? They still could have kept trillions of dollars more, but yet they could have just alleviated all of the private mortgage in this country, and how that would help the people, and the cash infusion, and entrepreneurs would be free of debt. They don't want you free of debt, folks, because the whole system is debt. If the debt system goes under or gets exposed, their plan goes under and gets exposed. And this is what they're doing with the P.I.G.S right now. Okay? So, let's read the last one. Let's read this last task that they wanted. When this leads eventually to the collapse of the whole banking system, then how to shift the losses from the owners of the banks to the American taxpayers. Do you think they've done that? I think they have. They've done it, $27 trillion worth. All these banks, too big to fail, too big to fail. We got to bail them, we got to bail them. Folks, that wasn't a bailout bill, that was a takeover bill. And now your children and their children for generations to come will never be able to pay this back. Folks, we gave them $27 trillion, and now we have to pay an interest to them because they gave us permission to give to them in the first place. Think of that. That should drive you insane. And where were your elected representatives? Certainly nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. There was some who spoke up, Representative Sherman, Representative Paul. There was some who spoke up. Bernie Sanders from the state of Vermont. Actually, Bernie Sanders, he got right into Ben Bernanke's face as much as the Senator can, and he said, are you going to tell the American people where this money went? And Ben Bernanke got right back in Bernie Sanders' face and just plainly said, no. I have no recollection, Senator. No. I don't have to tell you, is what he's telling the American people, because you are subservient to me. Your corporation went insolvent to my corporation through a corporate takeover in 1913. I don't have to tell you a thing, Senator. But at least Bernie Sanders made the effort. And he also made the, and not trying to speak up Bernie Sanders, I'm not trying to speak up Representative Sherman or Representative Paul or any of the few others that did speak up, but at least some of them did. At least some of them did. And what we're going on now in the area of the P.I.G.S, basically, folks, is just an expansion of the Federal Reserve through the Bretton Woods Agreement that took place right across the river here in New Hampshire. Okay? So I want to continue with some of this. There's another thing that I'd like to read with you about. We read about the panics, if you would, that were created by the Federal Reserve bankers, the real players, prior to 1913. But then I started doing some research about, well, what's happened since then? What's happened since these bankers have controlled the issuance of our currency? Well, it's presided over the crashes of 1921, 1923, 1929, the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939, recessions in 1949, 1953, 1957, 1967, 1969, 1975, and 1981, a stock market Black Monday, which we'll get into some point, in 1987. Now, and here's this, and over 1,000% inflation, which has destroyed 96% of the purchasing power of the dollar since 1913 when they took over. Folks, and this is why I use the example of 1964. My mother bought a house for $14,000. And then up to a couple of years ago, that house was worth $300,000. I remember penny candy for a penny in the early 60s. Now that penny candy is 35 cents. Folks, inflation is a hidden tax upon you. And the lower you are on the economic ladder, the more it affects you. And what it is that because they're printing so much of these worthless pieces of paper that have no intrinsic value behind it, it's fiat. And because it's debt-laden and debt-based, it takes more of these worthless pieces of paper to purchase the same entity. Has the house changed? Has the loaf of bread changed? Has the candy changed in value? No, not a bit. What changed was the medium of exchange, the other end of the bargain. I give you the candy bar, you give me a medium of exchange. The candy bar is the same. A Mounds is still a Mounds, a Milky Way is still a Milky Way, a Snickers is still a Snickers. That hasn't changed. What's changed is the medium of exchange. You've lost purchasing power. That's what's changed. So, again, this is since they've had control. Listen to these are recessions. Of course, then you've got to start getting into what the definition of recession is. All right? Now, folks, for the sake of time, I've gotten a little farther along on other things that I wanted to. I want to get into the IMF, and I want to just basically give you an understanding of what it is. And 1944 meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at which the world's most prominent socialists established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as mechanisms for eliminating gold from the world finance. The hidden agenda behind the IMF and World Bank is revealed as the building of world socialism and the role of the Federal Reserve in bringing that about. The game began at an international meeting of financiers, politicians, and theatricians held in July of 1944 at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was officially called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, but folks, you and I know it as the Bretton Woods Conference. Two international agencies were created at this meeting, the International Monetary Fund and its sister organization, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Folks, you know this agency as the World Bank. Now, here's how they sold it to the American people, all right? Of course, they did this in secret, but when they had to come out with it, because, oh, guess where all your income tax money goes? Yeah. It goes right here. It goes to these two organizations. Do you remember we read the Grace Committee verbatim to you? You remember that? We read this verbatim to you. Not 1 cent of your income tax money goes to what people consider the operations of the government. Well, then, Tom, then how do we pave the roads? How do we build bridges? You pay fuel taxes. You buy a set of tires, you pay road use taxes. You buy a spark plug, you pay road use taxes. You buy a gallon of gasoline, oil, whatever it may be, a car, a vehicle. Your income tax money, folks, goes to the International Monetary Fund per the Grace Commission that we read to you verbatim months ago. The announced purpose of these organizations were admirable. The World Bank was to make loans to war torn and underdeveloped nations so they could build stronger economies. The International Monetary Fund was to promote monetary cooperation between nations by maintaining fixed exchange rates between their currencies. It was used to terminate the use of gold as the basis of international currency exchange and replace it with a politically manipulated paper standard. Folks, this is their own writing. Did they give you all the gold to hang on to them? No. No. They took all your gold so they could hang on to it for you. Of course, you don't have access to that anymore. So, the Bretton Woods arrangement sought to recapture the advantage of the gold standards, currencies that were exchangeable at a stable and predictable rates into gold, and thus at a stable and predictable rates onto each other. And it sought to accomplish this with minimizing the pain imposed by the gold standard on countries. Folks, what is the pain of the gold standard? The pain of the gold standard is discipline. Because without fiat money, the government can only write checks to what they have reserves of gold or silver behind them. You get rid of that discipline, or as they call it here, the pain imposed by the gold standard. Their pain is that they just can't write the checks. They can't just take the liability and throw it on your shoulders. That's the pain that they're trying to get rid of. Now, they had to use the gold exchange, folks, for a while. And the reason is because people had a little bit of understanding of money back then. It was taught in the public schools. It was understood because I had gold and silver in my hand. I remember, folks, myself as a child, all the elders of my generation, and I'm talking folks that were brought up from, early 1900s on, they didn't call what we called change. They called it all my silver. Quarters, dimes, and nickels, they called it silver because it was silver. I remember a dear friend of my grandfather. He used to, and this was in 1964 and 65, and he understood what was going on. And he was a businessman. And he used to tell all you kids, put your silver away. Put your silver away. Of course, that silver back then was $2 an ounce. Today it's near $40 an ounce. A wise man would have listened to that elder. But this is the reason why, folks. So, again, when we talk about Bretton Woods Agreement, and we did a show on how we had Bretton Woods 2 here a couple of months ago. I think it was late May or early June. And no one, not even the local media, showed up at the Mount Washington Hotel to cover it. Nobody. You think it was important? It's where all your income tax money is going. It's where it's the mechanism that they're using to take all the intrinsic value of the pigs right now. And it's understood by people in Iceland and now more people in Greece of what's going on. Folks, if you look at what's getting burned in Greece, it's not the mom and pop shops. It's government buildings and banks. That's target specific. It's not mom and pops that places are burning. And this is why the police are reacting the way they are. It's the government buildings. It's the banks that are getting burnt. It's the exchange houses that are getting burnt. My God, someone's awoken in Greece. So, when you study, and of course we've gotten into this before, the International Monetary Fund appears to be part of the United Nations, much as the Federal Reserve System appears to be part of the United States government, but it is an entirely independent. Think of this. It's independent. It's an independent, non-government entity, and you are paying a high percentage of your labors and your wealth to it. And I have to ask you, have you ever seen the law that mandates you have to do this? I haven't. Joe Bannister hasn't. Joe Curran hasn't. Shirley Jackson hasn't. Edna Lane Brown haven't. Minus Edna Lane Brown, folks, the others that I mentioned were all former IRS agents that appealed to the IRS commissioner to demonstrate the law that says the average American has to pay. Folks, there is no law. How could there be a law that make you pay your labors to an outside foreign private corporation? You voluntarily applied to do this. This is important stuff, folks. Where's your media to cover this? Now, the people of Greece, what's going on is that basically, and we're running a little bit out of time, so I'm not going to be able to read it verbatim like I like to. I'm going to try to explain this in layman's terms. Basically, what's going on, folks, the common denominators of all these countries, like I said, they are all controlled by private banks. And let's look at the other side of this coin here. All the boogeymen of the world perceived by your mainstream media. Venezuela, Chavez. Libya, Gaddafi. Abidjan, Iran. You guess what them three leaders have not done? They have not allowed their countries to go into debt to the banking houses that control the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the P.I.G.S, and the rest of it. So why do you think they're the boogeymen? You know, I'm not talking up Gaddafi, but did you know that every person in Libya got $1,200 a month? Did you know that? Through oil reserve money? Something similar to what Alaska does? Did you know that you could go to 6 years of college in Libya for nothing and get a better education than you're going to get here in the United States? Did you know that Gaddafi had taken aquifers and put them in the southern part of his land and transferred water and now has one of the richest, most prosperous agricultural farms in all of the world? Did you know that Mr. Gaddafi announced to the world 3 weeks before our invasion that he was no longer going to accept his oil to be purchased in what we call dollars? Did you know that Mr. Gaddafi was going to create and was in the midst of creating a currency based on gold called the dinar? D-I-N-A-R, please look that up. The bankers couldn't have that. Folks, if they had a currency based on gold, everyone in the world is going to flock to it. Why would you want this fiat, debt-based, worthless piece of paper the American government, or the Federal Reserve puts out, backed by the American government, backed by your labors? Why? So what happens to this? We invade Libya, just take the place over. Did you know the Chinese had to expel 29,000 of their citizens? And did you know, folks, that the Chinese have lost literally billions and billions and billions in value of dollars to commerce and industry and agreements that they had there? Think of this. For Chavez, what did he do? He threw out the IMF. He freed his country of all the loan agreements. He nationalized the oil, kicking BP and others out, Saccone and so forth. But these are the boogeymen. Adeniran, the big boogeyman, because he's working on nuclear weapons. Israel's had nuclear weapons since 1963, but we're not going to worry about that. Why are they the boogeymen, folks? Because the bankers control your media. Where was the media at Bretton Woods 2 that just took place here 6 weeks ago? Even the local media. You know, where was the Caledonian Record, the local newspaper here? Where was the local television stations here? Not to be found. And that's a shame. Because you would, if a bunch of football, if the New England Patriots were there, oh boy, we would have had all kind of coverage of Britney Spears and entourage of entertainers, which could be, you could include politicians and entertainers, folks, that's all they are. They wouldn't be there. So what's going on and with the pigs, again, Greece, Italy, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, is the same thing that's going on that they tried to take place in Iceland. Basically, they create this debt, they being the bankers, and then they call it. And what I mean by call it is it's a call option. This is how they created the Great Depression, folks. They gave everybody credit, and then they called the loans, called call options. And what it was that, okay, now you got to pay. Well, who could pay? They put everybody in so much debt, there wasn't enough money to pay the loans. So everything was collateralized. And that's what's going on in Greece today. That's what's about to happen in Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. They're doing the same thing. And folks, this is why countries like Germany, that are really the biggest producer of all of euro, and I mean euro as in the currency, everyone that's under that, the Germans don't want to pay no more. I can't say as I blame them. The German people have been paying since 1945 for the restructuring and reprimands and so forth of World War II. Of course, if you really understood World War II, you would understand who financed Hitler and who put him into power. Who financed Mao Zedong and threw Chiang Kai-shek into a tiny island called Formosa. You now know it as Taiwan. Who financed Pol Pot? Folks, we finance all these people. You understand why? Through the IMF and through the World Bank, NAFTA and GATT and CAFTA and all these alphabet agencies are now taking all your jobs. You are financing the demise of your country because, folks, when you read these bills, you're going to find out, guess what? They get tax incentives to move the manufacturing bases of these companies overseas. And of course, the companies overseas welcome them with open arms. Why would you want to do business here? Devaluing currency, an intrusive and overpowering government, declining infrastructure, deliberate dumbed down population and populace. What's keeping them here? You add all that up and I get money to move? Doesn't take much to see, folks, where we're going and why we're on the road that we are. Watch what goes on in Greece. Watch what goes on in the pigs. Try to research what's going on in Iceland. I think you will be shocked to find out that Iceland, folks, on their own, is rather doing very well. And they don't have a lot of natural resources. They don't have a lot of industry to recover. They're doing rather well. Are they still in the hurt locker, as I say? Absolutely. But did they put themselves deeper into that hurt locker by just paying off the bankers the debt that they created? No. Did the country go into absolute turmoil and no one's doing business with Iceland no more? No, not at all. As a matter of fact, they're well on their way to recovery without paying off the international bankers. Folks, I have said it on this show before. Number one, if you're not watching this program, you need to start, or watching programs like it and reading books and finding information out. The time is limited. I do not watch a lot of mainstream media news, but I did have a friend of mine recently call about 4 or 5 weeks ago and say, Tom, you've got to watch this program. It came on again at 2 in the morning. So I did. And basically what it was, folks, it was a economist. His last name was Rogers. I think his first name was Jimmy, but don't hold that to me. Anyway, he was obviously very popular with the host of the program. I had seen his name on mainstream media writings and print before. And anyway, basically, the host of this program, his name is Glenn Beck, said, you know, Mr. Rogers, we've got 5 or 10 minutes left in the program. You know, what would you have to say to the American people? Well, folks, this is a mainstream economist. This is someone who plays along with the bankers, who is the parrot of what they want to be said to the American people to keep you in things like the stock market and so forth and keep you dumbed down. But there was 3 warnings he said, and 2 of them really stuck out to me. One was that he had taken all of his family and left the country. 2, he said, there was a chance that the dollar would collapse within 5 months and that the United States government would default. And 3, he said, if you live in the cities anywhere in this country, I don't care what you have to do, get out of them. And I thought about that statement. Folks, think of what's going to happen when all the welfare checks and all the subsidies stop in the city. Look what happens when the lights turn off. You can imagine what's going to happen when the subsidy checks cease. As always, folks, we are very thankful that you take time from your busy day to watch our program. We hope you find it interesting. And as always, we close reminding you that your government is your responsibility. Thank you for watching.
Got to read between the lines.